do you have problems in your life that you're not addressing that you could solve? And the answer is yes. And it's an easy thing to figure out. You sit on your bed one morning and say, okay, there's some things that need to be done that I don't want to do, that I could do, that would make things better by the end of the day. What are they? Well, your conscience will deliver those suckers in no time flat, man. And then you might have to say, okay, well, how do I entice myself into doing a few of those? And if you ask, instead of trying to force yourself to do it like you're a tyrant and a slave at the same time, you can usually negotiate with yourself so that you'll start to sort those things out. Sort them out. Put your house in order. And then move out. Move on. And out. Yes. That's a Freudian slip, by the way. Yeah. So it's important because the thing is, you have a practice domain. Right? There are things that are within your grasp that you could fix. Fix them. And you'll learn, because it's harder than it looks. Fix them and you'll learn how to fix things. And then something else will beckon as another problem that you could fix. You know, you all have your problems. What does that mean? Like, there's an infinite number of problems in the world. Some of them happen to be yours. Why is that? I don't know exactly. But you have your problems. Great. Solve them. You know, one of the things I learned as a therapist, every therapist has to learn this, is because one of the things you wonder when you're first starting to be a clinician is how do you not take the catastrophes of your clients home with you? And the answer to that is because it's immoral to. They're not your problems. They're their problems. Like, they're their life. You know, your problems are your life. You don't want to solve someone else's problems for them because you take away the deep meaning that's to be found in having them work through the problems on their own. And then you steal the credit. Well, I can help you with that. It's like, well, yeah, maybe, but I don't help you with the next problem then. So in any case, you sort out the problems that are right in front of you, and it will make you grow very, very rapidly. And then you'll be able to sort out more complex problems without making them worse. I don't want to calculate high-resolution utopia for myself only to have it squandered by fortune. How do I ensure the meaning I experience is self-determined? Well, you can't, because there's an arbitrary element to existence. So it is going to be squandered to some degree by fortune. But that's not the point. What are you going to do? Just sit back on your laurels and wait for things to roll over you? So what you do, look, the hero myth basically says, go out there, confront the dragon, get the gold, share it with the community, and live properly. Or it says, the alternative is, face the tyrant, enter the desert as a consequence because everything falls apart, recast structure, find the promised land. Those are the two elements to the hero myth. And that's divine. It's the closest thing to divine that we know. You might say, well, what happens if you follow the divine path? And the answer might be, well, everything turns out perfectly because God is on your side. It's like, no. That isn't what happens because things don't turn out perfectly. It's your best bet. It's your best strategy, right? That's the thing. And, you know, dragons wouldn't be dragons if they couldn't eat you. And so, but that's okay. That's okay. And this is something I found so useful about the biblical stories, especially about the Abrahamic stories, which I didn't know that well till I lectured about them last year. You know, God calls people to the adventure of their lives. And so you could say in part, God is that force within you which calls you to the adventure of your life. And it says, get away from your family, get away from your blind and unconscious comfort, and get the hell out there in the world. Well, God calls Abraham out from his fathers where he stayed far too long and from his kin where it's secure. And like the first thing he encounters is a famine, and then he encounters a tyranny inhabited by people who want to steal his wife. It's like you think, well, Abraham should have just stayed in bed and ignored God, obviously. Well, that isn't how it is. It's like we're built for struggle, us human beings. You're not after the bubbles of bliss that Dostoevsky described in Notes from Underground. We're built to contend with the world. We're built to contend with reality. You want a challenge. And the best way that you can take on a challenge, because a challenge fortifies you. So you don't want to be secure, you want to be strong. And you get strong by taking on optimal challenges. And so you lay out your destiny in the world and you take the slings and arrows of fate. And you make yourself stronger while you're doing so. And you might fail and fortune might do you in. But it's your best bet. And you know, people have Also, people that have extracted unbelievable successes out of catastrophic failures. And I'm not saying that in a naive way. I know perfectly well what happens to people. You're doing fine in life and then you get cancer, and then 6 months later you're dead. And all the heroism in the world isn't going to save you at that point. But that's not the point. That's not the point. Life is bounded by mortality. But that doesn't mean that you don't get out there and contend. And you develop by contending, and you minimize the net amount of suffering in the world. And that's something, man. That's something to do. So it beats laying in your basement and getting bitter and then doing the terrible things that bitter people do. So you can't ensure that the meaning you experience is self-determined, but you can play your role to the best of your ability, and that will be good enough. And that will be good enough. That meaning, the meaning that you'll find in that, I believe, is sufficient to be sustaining, and perhaps even sustaining through the flood. So it isn't that you can avoid catastrophe, it's that you can prepare yourself to deal with it honorably when it arrives. That's what you've got. There's a whole set of expectations that are governing what we're doing. Like, you don't want me to take your little tablet there and smash it. That would be shocking, right? You wouldn't know what the hell to do, right? You'd be somewhere different if I did that, and you wouldn't know where you were. And that's another thing to know, because that's a fundamental difference. There's a fundamental difference between knowing where you are and not knowing where you are. I think it's, in some sense, the fundamental difference. You can think about it as the distinction between explored and unexplored territory, but you have to. I don't know if you've ever taken a cat to a new house. Cats hate that. And because in their old house, and maybe in their old neighborhood, they've slunk around, at the edges, checking everything out. They start out afraid. They check everything out. They know where to hide. They know what's safe, and they know that because they go somewhere and nothing happens, and so then they assume that it's safe, and they slowly build up a neighborhood that they're comfortable with. My dad used to take the dog for a walk, and then the cat got lonesome, and so it started to follow him. And first of all, it would just go along the buildings, the houses on their route, hiding really from predators. And after a while, I got kind of comfortable with that, and then it would follow right behind the dog. But it had a border, and if my dad took the dog over one street too many for the cat would just sit on the corner and cry like a cat cries. It was like, that's it for me, man. I'm not going any farther out into the unknown. And so the distinction between the territory that you have mastered and the territory that you haven't mastered is a fundamental distinction. It's the distinction between home and the strange land. And the thing about familiar territory for people is that most of the familiar territory that we inhabit is other people, because we're so social. So you can't really think, it's a weird way of thinking about territory. It's not exactly geographical, objective territory. It's territory with a dominance hierarchy in it. And the dominance hierarchy has a predictable structure, and you know where you fit in it most of the time. And so that when you act out in that territory surrounded by your people, then often you get what you want. And you're so thrilled about that, because you just don't want someone acting erratically around you. And you know that. So you walk down Bloor, and there's people there that should really be institutionalized, but we deinstitutionalized them all so they could be free, and free to be, suffering and malfunctioning out on the street. That's what the freedom ended up being. But you'll walk by someone like that who's muttering away to the voices in his head, and maybe striking out against whatever it is that's plaguing him, and you won't make eye contact. You might even go across the street. You're certainly going to give him a wide berth. You're going to keep a distance between him and you, and you're going to hope that you don't attract his attention, because he's not in the dominance hierarchy, and you don't know what the hell he might do. And that's unexplored territory too. That's another way of thinking about it. Like, we inhabit time and space, not just space and not just time. We inhabit time and space. And our territories are spatial-temporal. We're here now. And this is safe now. And it's safe partly because of the physical structure and it's working. But it's also safe because none of you are manifesting peculiar behavior. But if you started to manifest peculiar behavior, if you stood up and started muttering or yelling, or maybe attacking someone next to you, all the rest of you would freeze first, because then all of a sudden this would be unexplored territory. The match between what you want, which is a peaceful lecture that you hope has some content, the match between what you want and what's happening has vanished. And so then you don't know where you are. And so then what do you do when you don't know where you are? What do you do when you don't know what to do? Well, if you're a computer, you just crash. But, you know, what good is that to you? You're just going to die? That isn't helpful. You freeze first, and then maybe you cautiously attend, or maybe you don't. Maybe you just keep your damn eyes averted and you sit there and you hope that no one notices you. That's a prey response, right? That's like a rabbit frozen when it thinks a fox is looking at it. And we were prey animals for a long time. There was a cat that they recently discovered, a prehistoric cat that had this bottom single tooth, and they found out that a human skull fit right inside its mouth, and so it could grab you here and pierce the back of your skull with its single tooth, and that's what it was evolved for. So, you know, it's under such conditions we evolved. And we're predators, obviously, but we're tasty predators. And so other things were perfectly happy to eat us. And so when you're where you don't know what to do, you act like a prey animal. And that's probably what you should do, because maybe if you keep your head down and shut the hell up, there won't be any attention attracted to you. And maybe you'll get through it. You know, you might decide, unlikely, to intervene and take the guy down, but you would be the exception rather than the norm, and it's unsurprising. That's Sisyphus, and Nietzsche said of Sisyphus, if I remember correctly, that one has to imagine him happy. Well, if there's a rock at the bottom of the hill, then you might as well push it up the hill, and if it rolls back down, well then you've got something else to do, don't you? You can push the damn rock back up the hill, and there's no shortage of rocks to push up the hill, and that's what we're built for anyways. And so let's go out and like push some damn boulders up the hill, and then maybe we could have enough self-confidence and enough respect for ourselves that we wouldn't have to turn to hatred and revenge and try to take everything down, because I think that's the alternative. So he's not weak, that's one thing you can say about him. The same idea represented there, right? That's Atlas, who voluntarily takes the world on his shoulders. It's like the idea of Christ taking the sins of the world on his shoulders. It's exactly the same notion, which is the notion that you should be able to recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity and take responsibility for it, because that's what that means. And the thing that's so interesting about that is that if you can recognize in yourself all the horror of humanity, you will instantly have a hell of a lot more respect for yourself than you did before you did that. Because there's some real utility in knowing that you're a monster. Now, and just because you're a monster doesn't mean you have to be a monster, but it's really useful to know that you are one. So, one of the things that Jung knew, and this is something that I find so amazing about his writings, and I think something that really distinguishes him, for example, from Joseph Campbell, who talked about following your bliss, is like Jung said very clearly that the first step to enlightenment is the encounter with the shadow. And what he meant by that was, everything horrible that human beings have done was done by human beings, and you're one of them. And so if you don't understand that, and to understand that really means to know how it was that you could have done it, and that's a shattering thing, to try to imagine that, to try to imagine yourself as someone who's engaged in medieval torture, to see how you could in fact do that. You're never the same after you learn that. But being never the same after learning that is unbelievably useful, because when you understand that that's what you're like, then you're a whole different creature. And I don't think, and this is something I did learn from Jung, is that you cannot be a good person until you know how much evil you contain within you. It is not possible. And it's partly because you just don't have any potency. Like,
if you're just naive, if you're just nice, if you'd never hurt anyone, you'd never hurt a fly, you don't have the capability for any of that, why would anyone ever take you seriously? You're a domestic animal at best, you know, and a rather contemptible one at that. And it's a very strange thing, because you wouldn't think that the revelation of the capacity for evil is a precondition for the realization of good. But I believe, first of all, why would you be serious enough to even attempt to pursue the good unless you had some sense of what the consequence was of not doing it? You have to be serious about these sorts of things. It's not the game of a child, right? It's the game of a fully developed adult. And I learned this in part when I had little kids. I wrote a chapter from my new book called Never Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And why was that? And I wrote that after I knew I was a monster. And I thought, I'm going to make sure I like my kids. I'm going to make sure they behave around me so that I like them. Because I'm way bigger than them. And I'm way more cruel than they are. And I've got tricks up my sleeve that they cannot even possibly imagine. And if they irritate me, I will absolutely take it out on them. And if you don't think that you're the sort of person that would do that, then you are the sort of person who is doing it.
It's because the bloody intellectual leftists have never apologized for their complicity in the catastrophes of the 20th century. The Germans apologized. Sorry about the Nazis. Well, the left-wing intellectuals, they say, oh, well, that wasn't real Marxism. It's like, oh, okay. How many corpses have to pile up around you before you're willing to question your beloved ideological presuppositions and face your resentment and your narcissism and your desire for destruction? You don't like people anyways. The planet has too many of them. So like a nice war might clear that up well. Then all the plants can grow again. You know, the Club of Rome, when they talked about the population explosion that was going to wipe out the planet by the year 2000, they said outright that human beings were a cancer on the planet. Lots of people think that. It's like, oh boy, let's put the atom bomb phone in your hands. Human beings are a cancer on the planet. What a hell of a thing to say. You can say that to a 4-year-old? I saw a bloody professor at Queen's University tell a whole room full of 18-year-olds that if they had an ethical fiber in their body, they wouldn't have any kids. Or they'd only have one. Because all they're doing is going out there and raping the planet. It's like, what the hell? I don't understand that. It's like human beings are hard on the planet, but it's pretty damn hard on us in return. You know, it's like we're just sort of trying not to die too miserably. And we make a bit of a mess while doing it. It's like, yeah, Christ, we've only known for 50 years that we were disrupting the oceans. How fast do you think we can learn? You know, 100 years ago, Thomas Huxley, who was a great biologist, said the oceans are so plentiful that there's not a chance we could ever put a dent in them. So that's only 100 years ago. 50 years ago, we thought, oh man, there's more of us and we're better at this than we thought. It's like, okay, how fast do you expect people to learn? You know, 1 generation, 1 year? We're trying to do our best. Most people are trying to do their best. And some people are trying to do their worst, but most people are trying to do their best. And so we should have a little compassion, a little sympathy for human beings instead of considering ourselves like raping, patriarchal, oppressive destroyers of the world. Jesus.
We certainly choose each other for self-awareness and consciousness and intelligence. And I don't, you know, if you're choosing a mate, there's an arms race in human beings. We're choosing intelligent mates, that's especially the case for women in relationship to men. So that the idea that that's a choice, well, that's partly why it's Eve that makes Adam self-conscious in the Garden of Eden, right? She offers him the apple. She's the one that makes him self-conscious. And I think that's actually accurate, because the evidence from the evolutionary biologists is that female sexual selection was one of the driving factors that differentiated us from chimpanzees. It's a major factor. Chimpanzee females are not selective maters. They go into estrus, they'll mate with anything. What happens is the dominant males chase the subordinate males away, and so they end up leaving more offspring, but it's not a consequence of selection on the part of the females. In human beings, it's completely different. Concealed ovulation and intense selection pressure from women on men. You have twice as many female ancestors as you have male ancestors. And people can never have a hard time working that out arithmetically, but it's not that problematic. You just think on average every woman had 1 child. Half of men had none and the other half had 2. And that's approximately correct if you average across the entire history of human sexuality. So human males in particular are subject to vicious selection pressure on the part of females, and I also think that's partly why nature is represented symbolically as female among human beings, because after all, nature is what selects. There's no better definition of nature than that which selects. You know, you can't let the orderliness part of you get the upper hand so terribly that it's impossible for you to live. That's what happens to girls who have anorexia, by the way. You know how you get, there's this idea with regards to anorexia that it's often high achieving girls who have it. Well, it's hyper conscientious girls. They get so disgust sensitive they can't stand their own bodies. And so, for example, then they stop being able to look at their bodies properly. And so what they do, instead of looking at their whole body, they lose the ability to do that. They only can see parts of their body, and then they can't tell the difference between a part that's healthy and well-shaped and a fat part. And so anything that's what would you call, of dubious, anything that's hard to measure becomes impossible to see. So I had an anorexic client at one point. She wasn't a very big woman, maybe about this big and thin, yes, obviously. And so I was trying to work with her on her body perception disorder, and one of the things I did was, so I had her come and sit beside me. So I was sitting like this, and so was she, and I said, well, you look at our two thighs, which one is bigger? And like mine was like 40% bigger. And she said, well, I can't tell, they look the same to me. And so I said, okay, this is what we're going to do. I let her do it. I said, you take a pencil, and I'll sit on a piece of paper, and you just trace my thigh, okay? And then you can put that piece of paper underneath your thigh and trace it, and then you can look at the difference. Well, so I had her do that, and she looked at the two pieces of paper, and she couldn't believe it. She could not believe that that was actually the case, because her perception had become so disordered that it was impossible for her to see the real shape of her body. And we would go outside, and I would ask her, you know, is that person thin? Is that person fat? And with other people she could tell, but with her own body, not a chance. She couldn't see it properly at all. And so there's a real obsession with purity among women who have anorexia. You know, they'd like to starve themselves right down to the bone, because the bone is sort of pure and white and there's no excess tissue on it. And so anorexia also looks like a disease of disgust. And so it's very, very difficult to, she thought in very black and white terms. One of the things I had her do at one point was, said, she has a music, she said, I either really like a song or I don't like it at all. And I said, okay, well, you've got a music collection. Why don't you go through like 20 of those songs and rate them on a scale from 1 to 10? And she couldn't do it. It was either yes or no, orderly, right? The boundaries around the categories were absolutely segregated. And her apartment tended to be decorated in black and white. And she was hyper clean, you know, so everything in the apartment was extraordinarily orderly, well put away. She couldn't stand to see anything disgusting on the counters and that sort of thing. So very, very difficult disorder to treat, anorexia. Very, very difficult. So, and you know, you can see how it can go wrong, because food, you know, when you're eating, your disgust systems are on alert, you know, like you want the thing you want to eat, and you absolutely don't want the thing you don't want to eat. And your mouth is very sensitive to that sort of thing, you know, to the texture and all of that. And your sense of smell is very sensitive to that sort of thing, because, you know, you don't want to eat anything that's contaminated or poisonous. So it's another situation like sex, where the reward system is driving you forward to engage in a consumatory behavior, but the disgust system is right there modulating and moderating it, and there's a tension between those two things that's always at work. And with the anorexic types, the disgust system gets the upper hand. So she was also extraordinarily judgmental and perfectionistic, but that goes along with it, because orderly people are judgmental and perfectionistic. And so if you're a perfectionist, often what that means is you have very high levels of orderliness and very high levels of neuroticism. And those two things chase each other around like mad, because you can't stand the idea that you would make a mistake, and you get anxious about it as well. So then you get stuck in this perfectionistic mindset and you can't get out of it. So